Now, NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio with Lee Witting. Whether you're listening on TalkZone, by podcast, through the archives of our ad-free shows on our YouTube channel, or by connecting through our Facebook page. There is considerable evidence that young children, up to the age of 5 or thereabouts, seem sometimes to have a foot in both worlds. That is, they have retained memories of a past life or a memory of the time they spent planning for this one. I've talked before on the show about when a 4-year-old boy told his pregnant mother he hoped his little sister would be born soon, and when she asked him why, he told her he wanted to talk to her because he was forgetting what heaven was like. We have done a number of NDE radio shows where children have told details of past life memories to their parents, but it's terribly jarring when a child tells family members that they have had a premonition that they will die before their parents do, and sometimes very soon indeed. One famous case goes back to July 17, 2014, when a Russian missile brought down Malaysian flight MH17 over Ukraine. For those of us who remember, one story jumps out to all of us interested in premonitions of the other side. One crash victim, 11-year-old Miguel Panduinata, had for days before the accident been asking his mother questions like, "How would you choose to die? Will I not feel anything because our souls go back to God?" Today's guest, Virginia Hummel, had an equally troubling experience when her own son predicted his death to her. From the hundreds of after-death communications following it, including the appearance of a brilliant ball of light, she connected with the afterlife and uncovered the workings of a divine plan. Virginia is a spiritual grief coach, dynamic speaker, and creator of bereavement healing for the enlightened soul. She's also co-producer of a documentary on healing grief through spiritually transformative experiences. She's a lifelong student of the metaphysical, spiritual, and after-death subjects. Her interest in the world of the unseen was sparked at an early age by her own out-of-body experiences and communication with the other side. And with the death of her son, Virginia experienced a series of spontaneous spiritual events which helped her shift her perception of death, reclaim her life after loss, and rejoice in her newfound connection to the spirit. Virginia, welcome to NDE Radio.
My gosh, thank you, Lee. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, listen, could you tell our audience about your story?
Well, just like Miguel knew that something was happening, he didn't know what, but he had a premonition, the little boy on the Malaysian flight. My son also had a premonition, and it started with his birth. The day I held him, I knew that he was going to cross before I did. And it was such a horrible thought. I didn't know where that knowledge was coming from. I only knew that it was very powerful and profound. And for 25 years, I held my breath. I didn't know when it was going to happen, but I knew something was going to happen. And as a teenager, he came to me and told me when and how. He said he knew when and how he was going to die, but he didn't want to share that information. And eventually, I got him to tell me that he would die at 52, but my son died at 25. And it was about 6 months after his death that I recalled our conversation and saw those numbers reverse themselves to 25, and he died at 25 years old. I had also had a premonition the evening before his death, and I climbed into bed early, and as I was laying there, I thought to myself, geez, I'm taking a break while my son is lying dead in a ditch somewhere. And I thought, why would I think that? How horrible. Yet not, 6 or 7 hours later, that's exactly where the police found him. He had a motorcycle accident. And where does this information come from, Lee? This was, it not only bothered me, but it intrigued me. It bothered me on one level because as a mother, we want to do everything we can to protect our children. But on another level, was I receiving information to help me in my son's crossing, to help me with my healing? That was the big question. And, the little boy on the Malaysian flight, Miguel, he knew something was up. He hugged his mom the night before and didn't want to let go. He asked her what would happen if the plane crashed. He asked her all of those, what happens when we die. And, there's several other mothers. One was in the news. Her name is Scarlett Lewis. She was a mother from Sandy Hook who lost her little boy, Jesse, in the Newtown shooting. And she knew at his birth that she wouldn't have him long. And the week before he crossed over, he asked his father about how he would be able to recognize his grandmother in heaven when he died. And his dad was very puzzled by a question like that from a little 6-year-old, but
Sure.
he was insistent. And then the day of the shooting, the little boy's parents were supposed to meet him after school, and he was sure it wasn't going to happen. He was very melancholy. And then he got out of the car, and his dad walked him into the hallway, into the school, and he put his hands on his dad's shoulders, and he said, "Dad, I want you to know it's all going to be okay, and that I love you and Mom." And he turned around and walked off. And a week later, Scarlett received a package of her little boy's things from his classroom, and in there was a picture he had drawn of a little boy with angel wings and a big menacing individual standing across from him with his face was blacked out. So clearly this little boy knew something was up. Mary Neal, author of To Heaven and Back, she had an amazing near-death experience during her kayaking accident. But what intrigued me was her conversation she had had with her son, Willie, at somewhere between age 4 and 5. She remembers something along the lines of, Willie, when you're 18, and Willie stopped her and said, "Mom, I am not going to be 18. Don't you remember that was the plan?" And she said it stuck a knife in her heart, but she really relished and cherished each day she had with her son. And several months before Willie died, he asked about a will and a life insurance policy. And then a few days before, he began talking about, with his friend, where does the soul go? What is a soul? They were talking about death and what happens when you die. And then the day of his death, he and his friend were training roller skiing, and they crested this beautiful ridge, and with this, I think it was along Sunset, and he just said, "Gosh, wouldn't this be the most wonderful scene if this was the last thing that we saw?" And 3 minutes later, he was killed by a car. So clearly there's something of a spiritual nature happening, and I think it's really important that we as members of IANDS and those that know about these amazing signs, that we could get this information out to other parents, other mothers who've lost their children, family members who've lost loved ones, to help them understand there is something of a spiritual nature. There is a divine order and a plan. And this is really what helped me in my grief healing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, Virginia, that by knowing something is coming, we have any capacity or ability to change it or prevent it in the case of the death of a child? Or is it is it predestined? Is it set in stone?
Well, that is a great question, Lee. In Mary's case, Mary Neal's case, her son said he was going to die at 18, but he didn't die until age 19. And just before his 19th birthday, Mary had a dream in which a young man came to her, an after-death communication, a young man came to her and said that he was trading places with Willie. And she found out the next day that a young athlete had been killed in an accident, and Willie lived another year. I think it's possible that we have a variation on this storyline that we're living, but I think, my research and my experience tells me that there is a divine order, there is a divine plan, and we may have a little leeway, one of the things I struggled with, and I know that many parents struggle with, is the guilt. If I'd known at the birth of my son that he was going to die before I did, shouldn't I, as a parent, have done everything in my power to keep him safe? And that was a really tough thing to swallow as a mother who was newly in grief. But I realized that it didn't serve me to hold on to that guilt, to think like that. What I had to understand is that I gave my son the opportunity to live his life the way he wanted. Believe me, when he walked out the door to tell me he was going cliff diving, I didn't have a panic attack and think back to that moment that he was born. But we have to, we're souls here experiencing this wonderful earthly experience to learn and to, go through all the emotions and the joys. And I believe that each of us has our own individual mission. So, one thing I would like to mention is that as a child, I knew I was given a set of instructions, but I couldn't figure out what they were. And a set of instructions from God, from the other side, I recognized there was another side. But it wasn't until after the death of my son that I became very clear on what that message was that I had forgotten so long ago. And I think if we're able to maybe step back from these tragic experiences that we have, and we're given the opportunity to become aware of these spiritually transformative experiences, the STEs, these events, the premonitions, the after-death communication, the knowing, pre-birth contracts, the amazing information that near-death experiencers bring back, that they can really help us shift our perception of death and aid in our healing of grief.
Yes. Now, you had early on some out-of-body experiences, is that right?
I did, and they were as a child, and in fact, I had one about 2.5 years ago, and it was just very brief, but it was just after an energy worker had worked on me to help clear some trauma, and as I was laying on the table relaxing, I left my body and became this huge sphere. I must have been 15 feet across, and I don't recall being in a physical form, but my consciousness was there. And I looked back at myself on the table, and my first thought was, holy cow, this is absolutely incredible. And then my human self realized that something wasn't right. Oh my gosh, I had disconnected from my body. I was outside my body, and boom, I was sucked back in. But, Lee, have you had anything like that, an out-of-body? I know you've had a near-death.
Yes, and it was pretty much an out-of-body experience, and except for what I saw, where I saw I could go. But yes, I was. Well, it's on the website. But I drowned as a 7-year-old and was up in a birch tree watching as my mother rushed down to the shore and dove in and found me and pulled me out. And so I saw there was a light I could go into as well, but I decided to stick around. No one told me I had to make a decision one way or the other. I just did. Mm-hmm. But when you were a child, do you remember anything about those out-of-body experiences?
I don't remember specific events. What I do recall, which was very pivotal in my grief journey with my son, was I can remember, I think I was about 8 years old, and I was standing in my driveway, and no one was around, and I can remember asking myself, how did I get to be me? How did I get in this body? And I can remember pinching my arm, and I could say, gosh, I'm here all right, but why didn't I come back as my brother or my mother or my dog? Now, those were lofty thoughts for a young child.
Yes, indeed.
Thought anything about that. My parents, my mom, we were Christian Scientists, and it was, you go to heaven when you die. Well, what's heaven? But for me to think that and to contemplate that, and so as I traveled, my road in life, I continued to have experiences that were not explain it. My parents couldn't explain these, nor could I talk to my parents about these experiences. And both my son and my older daughter are very psychic, and they had a very strong connection. And when he crossed over, he contacted her quite a bit through the after-death communication, and I was contacted quite a bit. It was it really, the one thing about these spiritual events, these spiritually transformative experiences that we can have, is they can help to shift our perception of death. Thus, they offer us the opportunity to really shift our grief journey, to take control of something which we know in the traditional grief experience to be a very painful and disparaging type of journey. Most people feel that you're sentenced to a lifetime of despair. But what I discovered in this whole experience, when I combined my experience at age 8, these out-of-body, recognizing that I came from somewhere else, little events, manifestations, and voices, and after-death communications through the dreams, what I realized is there was something happening. And during my grief journey, when I began to open myself up to those kinds of experiences, it lifted me up out of that despair and that pain and that sadness, and it began to fill me with joy. Now, I felt like a washing machine on agitate, for goodness sakes, because I had my mother's broken heart. But I was also touching the divine. My son was everywhere. Lee, I would love to share one of the most profound experiences I had during my grief journey.
Yes.
My son would come as a hummingbird, and when I would think of him, a little hummingbird would come up to the window. And about a month after my son's death, I was in my garage cleaning out, going through some of his boxes and his things, and my heart was breaking, and tears were spilling down my cheeks, and suddenly a little hummingbird flew into the garage, halfway in the garage, right in front of me, 3 feet in front of me, and hovered and looked right at me. And I suddenly had this shift in energy, and I could feel my son Christopher everywhere. And the moment I was lifted from despair to hope that there was something more happening, that little bird took off. He came to shift my energy. Well, about 2 years later, I moved to a new house. And in the interim, I would think of my son Chris, and a little hummingbird would appear, and it truly lifted me. So I was in the brand new house, and the moving van hadn't arrived yet, and I was unpacking some boxes, and I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if my son knows I moved. And then I chided myself, well, of course he does. And I suddenly heard a little brrrr, and I thought, what is that noise? And I went to investigate, and I went into the great room, and I left the door open, a sliding door open about a foot. And in the great room was a little hummingbird. And he had flown in, and he was trying to escape through one of the large picture windows. And I thought, oh, my gosh, how am I going to get this little bird out? I don't have a net or a broom. I can't chase him out this door. What do I do? Suddenly, I was compelled to walk towards this little bird. And I walked towards him, and I stopped about 10 feet away from the glass window. And I don't know what made me do this other than it was a message from Spirit. I closed my eyes, and I raised my hand into the air. And that little bird lighted on my fingertips. And
wow.
I couldn't believe it. I had goosebumps. I lowered him down. I'm looking at this little bird in just such gratitude of the divine nature of everything around me. And suddenly I could feel my son. He was in the air I was breathing. He was in the sunlight streaming through the window. And I said, Chris, you're here. And there sat this little hummingbird with 1 foot on my index finger and 1 foot on my middle finger. And he was magnificent. But yet I could feel my son everywhere in the room. What a healing moment that was for me. And
yes.
goodness, I just know that when we can show people and grieving people out there that there's truly something more, we can really shift their whole grief journey. We can allow them the opportunity to create something, to lift the limits off the traditional grief experience and really lift the limits off their ability to completely heal from a tragic event.
Now, when you do spiritual grief counseling, do you encourage people to be alert to the possibilities of after-death communication? And the second question, or the second part of that question is, and if they don't feel that they've had anything like that, do they feel deprived or somehow lacking?
Well, the first question, yes, I do. It's important that we allow people to know that there's many different ways that our loved one lives on, not only in our hearts, in that love in our hearts, but there's ways to connect with them through the after-death communication, certainly. And yes, many people are sad. They want so much to have a spiritual experience. But what I found, the key to having these spiritual experiences and connecting with your loved one is not only remaining open to the possibility of having it, it is shifting your energetic level, your vibrational level. Despair and grief, anger, fear, all of that, it sends a specific energetic imprint out into the universe. And it is the furthest, fear and grief and pain are the furthest away from the divine feeling of love. Love and joy and excitement are very, very high spiritual experiences. So what I noticed during my grief experience that I could share with the individuals that I work with is that when I shifted my thoughts from something sad, because I realized a thought created a feeling, it preceded a feeling, when I began to consciously choose my thoughts and begin to become excited and joy-filled, even in the deep midst of my despair from the very beginning, I realized it shifted my vibration and it opened me to these little miraculous events that were happening, that Spirit was giving me and allowing me to know that life continues on. Consciousness survives the death of the physical body. And one thing we have to understand about grief, we all have to grieve. We have lost a loved one. Someone we love so deeply has died, and there is that lost connection with them in the physical. So we must listen to our body and our heart. When we're in pain, get out on the floor and wail, which is what I did. I wailed with the best of them. But in the moments I wasn't wailing, I was joyfully and excitedly waiting for a connection to my son. And that's what's important, to know that we have the opportunity to do both, and that by recognizing that we can lift the limits off the grief, we don't have to be in that state of despair all of the time, that it is okay to give ourselves permission to go back and forth, to reach out, to reach up, and to lift ourselves up out of that grief, even though maybe 10 minutes later we get sucked back down into it. But that's the most important thing, to help people recognize there is a way to do it, and there is a way to shift your energy to really participate in these spiritual experiences.
Why do you suppose, if we have a hand in planning our lives before we're born, why would we plan such devastating experiences into the mix of being alive on Earth?
Well, that's a great question. If we really embrace the notion that we are eternal beings and that our consciousness never dies, then we are only here in an earthly body for a limited time. And this is my personal opinion, but in my research and experience, I have come to realize we do live on, and we actually drop our body much like a vehicle. And you know that firsthand, Lee, by your near-death experience when you drowned and you were sitting up in a tree. You stepped out of that physical. So sitting up in a tree, you could step outside of the drama that was happening around you, watching your mom, in a panic race to save you, to pull you from the water, but you probably sat there and watched impartially as this was happening. So with that in mind, if we can be impartial on the other side and say, gosh, this is what I would like to experience this time, knowing full well that no matter how traumatic and horrible an event we experience, we have the ability to leave our body afterwards and be perfectly fine, perfectly whole in God's divine light, that spark of light, in that divine consciousness, and be okay. And this is really what I tried to wrap my mind around as I was going on through my grief journey with my son. Even though I knew in advance, I was told in advance he would die before I did, and I studied spirituality and metaphysics, I still was not prepared for the physical pain that accompanied that, but with the understanding that it was a momentary pain. Many near-death experiencers talk about the moment of impact with a vehicle and they pop right out of their body. I clung to that knowledge and that information that near-death experiencers had given when I thought about my son's motorcycle accident. He impacted the metal pole of a chain link fence buried in concrete with his back. And as a mother, I could only hope that at that moment of impact, his soul or consciousness energy popped out of his body, and yet his physical body remained. And that gave me great comfort to embrace the notion that we are eternal beings.
One of the thoughts that crossed my mind when we've heard of all these terrible experiments in executing prisoners, and for instance, the last one in Arizona where a person took 2 hours of suffering to die, one would hope that his soul could leave that torture and maybe observe it from a distance, but not have to go through it.
Well, we would all hope that, but I wonder, in this greater scheme of things, in this master plan, Mary Neal, in her book To Heaven and Back, talks about the pre-birth planning that we do with God and an angel prior to our incarnation on this life, and that we really know, the pattern and the mission that we're on, the experiences we're going to have, and I believe there's a little leeway. And this gentleman who experienced this 2-hour ordeal, if he was unconscious, maybe it's also like those our loved ones in hospitals who are unconscious. They are out of body and watching from a distance. We don't know until we actually physically and spiritually go through that ourselves, although and other NDE experiencers understand that. Have you heard of Michael Newton? He wrote Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls.
Yes.
He did a past life regression, a lives between lives regression with a woman whose I think her parents had been in the Holocaust, and she was very angry over those events. And of course, they were traumatic event in history. But what she realized during her life between life experience was that we are all these souls with this enormous capacity for love that's at our core, and that we choose these dramas. We participate in groups in these dramas here on earth. And she understood, she had the ability to look at the man who was the guard. It might have even been her experience. And she realized that it was much more difficult for him as a soul to play the role of the brutal guard than it was for her to play the victim, his victim. And yes, when she came out of that life between life experience, she said she would have much rather have been the victim than the soul that had played the guard. And she said she was healed. That pain and that anger from that traumatic event left her.
Virginia, we are
I'm afraid we're out of time. And I want you to tell folks how they can get in touch with if they'd like to learn more.
VirginiaHummel.com, and I talk all about these spiritually transformative experience in my book, Cracking the Grief Code. I'm happy to help anybody to understand this a little bit more. And Lee, gosh, thank you so much for inviting me on the show today.
Well, thank you so much. This was very, very interesting.
My thanks once again to Virginia Hummel, and be sure to check out her website, virginiahummel.com, for her book, Cracking the Grief Code, and more. If you'd like to hear this show again or any of our more than 500 archived ad-free NDE interviews, go to TalkZone's NDE Radio site and hit the Past Shows button, or go to our YouTube channel, NDE Radio with Lee Witting, where you can subscribe to and comment on the complete NDE Radio library. And listen again next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern at TalkZone for more NDE Radio. I'm your host, Lee Witting, saying once again, thanks for listening.